Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. Okay, so this episode is going to have the most interesting housekeeping of them all, because I literally almost died before this episode came out. A car accident. Not to bore you with the details, but just letting you know, I'm clearly fine, obviously. I wouldn't be making this episode if I wasn't fine. At least physically. Mentally, I don't know. But then again, things weren't really right up here all anyways. But the thing actually made me do something very interesting. You may have seen it if you follow me on Twitter. And if you don't follow me on Twitter, go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Pluribus Unum YT. But I posted a video that I've been planning to make for a while. But it's kind of dark to say it, but I'll just say it just so that you know, to be prepared, I guess. Basically, what I did was post a death video, as in a video that I scheduled to come out like pretty far off into the future, so that in case I die, there's like an official video that is put out basically saying like, you know, don't wait up. And of course, the whole point is, like, if I'm still there, I'll like move the deadline. Like, if I get close to the deadline, I'll move the video upper so that it like the deadline doesn't get reached. You know, I don't want the video to be posted and, you know, have to like scramble at the last minute to make sure things don't go bad. Would be a really dark April Fool's joke if I did that, but I made sure not to schedule in April for that reason. The reason I didn't do it is because I feel that it would be very like dark and probably not good for my mental health to see like the first video like in the feed. Like when I go upload a video now, I literally have to go to the thing, and the first words that'll be on the thing are, "If you're watching this video, I am dead." It's like, it's a bit dark to think. But anyways, let's get off that dark topic and get right into the news. First, an Ecuadorian indigenous leader has died. Damn it. I guess we're still on this topic. Okay, so an indigenous leader named Eduardo Medulla, an Icofan indigenous leader, I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing any of those right. He was a environmental activist that was fighting against oil extraction in the Amazon rainforest because it would affect his people and others. And he was a member of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador. He was shot 12 times by two armed men wearing hoods while he was in his home garden in the town of Doreno. And of course, many people are pointing to the fact that this is right around the time that he was leading like an action to fight against Petroecuador, the state-run petroleum company, from expanding its drilling in the region that he was like in. And I mean, like, the fact of the matter is, it's very likely that it happened. It's very likely that is exactly what happened. Like, I mean, maybe not directly, like, you know how this is gonna go. Like, they're not gonna be directly hired by the people of that company. They're gonna be like, they hire someone to hire somebody. In third world countries, everybody makes the thing like, oh, the laws are like really, really lax. Especially towards a population that probably does not have that many rights in a country that is governed by a conservative. Very tragic that this happened, and I hope that this doesn't end the fight that the people there need. So anyways, next story is an update of an election. Finally, we learn who won the Nigerian presidential election. And shock of all shocks, Tinubu was declared the victor. And shock of all shocks, the opposition is not happy. As I mentioned in the previous episode, there were a lot of issues with how Nigerians' elections were being held. Like, power went out in certain areas, certain vote totals were being counted wrong. Like, there was like one area where it was like more people in the area were counted for one candidate than there were people living there. Like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's like, let's just say like, 175 people live in this town. And from a first glance, you would see that the vote totals for each of the candidates in that town were pretty even. However, you then realize that the total number is 195, and conveniently those extra 20 people voted for Tinubu, and thankfully the opposition has declared that they're going to challenge the election results. Now, I'm not just saying this because I don't like Tinubu. Frankly, I didn't really like any of the candidates except for Obi, and maybe like one of the like really small socialist candidates. I don't know. They had like one or two socialist candidates, I think. But I mean, even if it was like the fourth guy, Kwankwanso, like that would be different. But it was like Tinubu and Abu Bakar were both well known for like stealing votes. That was a thing that ended up happening. Those two were caught literally stealing votes for themselves. Like, I mean, and if there were no issues with votes, I wouldn't mind. Like, if Tinubu wasn't on the record as like, and even it's just obvious that Tinubu doesn't seem like he would be a good candidate. It's like he didn't run at all during the election, so it doesn't make sense that he would win the election. There were some people who were saying like it does kind of make sense because people would vote for like ethnic or religious lines, and if it was that, but there were no voting irregularities at all, then that'd be one thing. But there are tons of voting irregularities in this cycle, and this country has a vast history of election rigging. So it very much seems unlikely that Tinubu won. And I'm not even saying that Obi won. Maybe Abu Bakar still managed to win. Like, it doesn't matter. But I do remember, like, everybody was saying, like, if the election was fair, Obi would have won. But if the election was unfair, Tinubu would win. Sure enough, what ended up happening? But we'll have to wait and see how this election goes around. Speaking of waiting, we don't have to wait for this election, the Chicago mayoral race. And the results came in pretty fast, at least for one candidate. And then the other candidate, we had to wait a little bit longer to figure out who it was, but it became pretty obvious who it would be pretty soon. So what ended up happening is that we now have our runoff. Shock of all shocks, Paul Vallis would actually make it to the runoff. I mean, that's actually not a shock of all shocks. Everybody expected that Paul Vallis would end up going to the second round. He was the only candidate that was running for his particular field. I guess there's no beating around the bush here. Conservative white man. That was basically his crowd. The real question was, who was going to join him? Now, originally, everybody was thinking that it would be like Chuy Garcia. Like, Chuy Garcia was seen as the de facto leader of the anti-Vallis vote, but then it was like Lori Lightfoot and Brandon Johnson ended up getting some second wins, and it was like, okay, this is actually interesting, to the point where people weren't even sure who would make it to the runoff, like, for any of the top two. Vallis Lightfoot, Johnson Lightfoot, Johnson Garcia, Garcia Vallis. Every single combination of those top four people seemed likely. But what ended up happening was the most shocking one. Vallis and Johnson, Brandon Johnson, had actually made it to the runoff with Paul Vallis. Lightfoot came in third, and Chuy Garcia came in fourth. Now here's the thing, you might think that I'm disappointed, but I'm not. Because this has actually proven me right. Now you might say, but didn't you back Chuy Garcia? Aren't you the biggest Chuy stan in the world? Yes. But in the lead up to Chuy Garcia announcing that he was going to run for Chicago mayor, I made a statement that is readily available on my channel, and I think I made posts about it on Twitter as well, where I talked about when Brandon Johnson announced that this was kind of a big problem for Chuy Garcia. And throughout the race, Chuy Garcia made it abundantly clear that yes, this was going to be a big problem for him. Because the left in Chicago desperately wanted him to run. Like, they were pushing for Chuy Garcia to run for a long time. But there was one big problem. The time for him to run for Chicago mayor happened to be during the lead up of his bid for the House and then his tenure in the House. So it just seemed like there was no room for him to do his duties in the House of Representatives and move forward with a Chicago mayoral race. So many people said, alright then, I guess he just does not want to run. So Chicago progressives then turned to Brandon Johnson to be their candidate, and he accepted. But then, not that long after Brandon Johnson announced, Chuy Garcia made the announcement that he was looking into running for Chicago mayor. And then he formally announced 14 days after Johnson announced, making him the last candidate to enter the race. But the problem was, everybody was expecting that Garcia just was not interested due to the fact that they've been pressuring him to run for a long time. So anybody who wanted to endorse Chuy Garcia, who could have and probably would have endorsed Chuy Garcia, didn't do so. They backed Brandon Johnson. Carlos Ramirez Rosa, Jonathan Jackson, Delia Ramirez. The latter two, I think, literally owe their careers to a degree to Chuy Garcia because it was his endorsement that pushed them over the edge in their primaries. But they chose to not endorse him back because by the time that he had announced, Johnson was already running and was already qualified. So it was like there was no reason for them to change their endorsement unless Johnson was disqualified, and he never was. And that left Chuy in a bit of a bind because his entire base was gone. And I'm not in Chicago, but I was the only person outside of Chicago who seemed to acknowledge this. Everybody else who was outside of Chicago literally was just like, no, you don't understand. The progressive vote's just going to consolidate around Chuy Garcia near the end of the race. Johnson's going to have this like little bit of a fervor, but then people are going to realize and they're just going to back Garcia. Now, it's not unprecedented because that is what happened in the last Chicago mayoral race, where people were thinking, this candidate is really good. It's tactical voting. Like, they thought that someone like Amara Anaya was good, or like LaShawn K. Ford, but then they're thinking like, do I really want to have another Daley being a popular political family in Chicago, to run the city? And they would decide to vote for a candidate they didn't necessarily agree with at the top of the ticket. Like in that case, maybe it would be Tony Preckwinkle, or in really hard hindsight, Lori Lightfoot. But the thing was, Chuy just couldn't wait for them to come to him because he needed to make sure that he was a viable candidate regardless. Because those people would be saying in the polls, like, they'd be backing Johnson, not Garcia. So he needed to make sure that he was staying at the top of the field. So what ended up happening is, Chuy Garcia, he started, like, making some statements that would bring more moderate candidates and more moderate Democrats to be backing him. And that, in turn, made progressives who were still backing Chuy Garcia to leave and flock to Johnson. So Johnson then started becoming, like, more popular in the polls. So now people were thinking, we actually don't need to just suck it up and vote for Garcia. We can vote for Johnson, because Johnson can actually win. One way to show that this was a big problem was that one of the most right-wing people I can think of, Doug TenNapel, the person who made hit Nickelodeon shows like Cat Scratch and the popular video game Earthworm Jim, yes, he's apparently a very prominent conservative commentator, literally made a video which was essentially a puff piece for Chuy Garcia. Granted, it was mostly because he didn't like Lori Lightfoot, because Lori Lightfoot became a prominent face for the Democratic Party, and he responded to her criticisms of he didn't do anything in his political career, and he said his biggest career choice would be to take you down, but it was still a puff piece nonetheless. So sadly, Chuy Garcia just did not manage to fulfill his expectations. And also, I think many people might not have voted for him because of the, issues of like, oh, we're going to have to vote for his House seat. And now this begs the question, what's going to happen next? Because now we're having a Vallas v. Johnson runoff. And here's the results that have been gone so far. Like, Vallas had got 33.53% of the vote, and Johnson had 20.54% of the vote. It's a pretty steep margin, honestly. Like, I mean, it's not, like, impossible, but it's definitely a steep margin, obviously. But many people are wondering, okay, what's going to happen now? Well, all the polls, like, you see, to be honest, this was not the most, like, sought-after, like, option. Like, they're basically polls for literally every other, like, look, here are how many polls they've been done for, like, Lightfoot v. Garcia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lightfoot v. Vallas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It was not really a popular on Garcia v. Vallas. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was like not really like a but now like Paul Vallas versus Brandon Johnson. They got 3 polls. Granted, some matchups like any matchup with Willie Wilson only had 2 ones, but it just, again, it was not really that much of a. This was not the one that they were expecting. So Vallas is winning 2 polls and Johnson's winning 1, and that one was done very early on in the race. Actually, all 3 of them were done relatively close. One was done January to February the 3rd, then February 12th to the 15th, and then February 22nd to 25th. Like, it was around a decent amount of time, but, like, people, again, this was not the one that they were expecting. So, again, a steep race, but what ends up happening for the runoff is that all of the people, or at least some of the people who are going to be, like, who were the other candidates, Lightfoot, Garcia, Wilson, Jamal Green, Cam Buckner, Sophia King, and Roderick Sawyer. All of them, or at the very least some of them, will probably be pledging their support to one of the other candidates. And that might be the kingmaker for the race, especially if they need to get Lightfoot or Garcia's endorsement, which is funny because Lightfoot's endorsement is going to be would be both the silver lining, but also the, probably the killing thing. Since she's third place, she's sort of the kingmaker of the race, but she's also very unpopular, which is why she's not in the runoff at all. If I were to make predictions right now, I would say that every single one of the people in the race will, if they do back anybody, they'll probably be backing Johnson. The only things I could potentially see is Lightfoot and Wilson backing Wallace. But then again, one of the other candidates, Jamal Green, who was a huge Bernie crat and was I guess sort of the most fringe left wing, apparently. I don't really know, because there were some things that he did in the race that were oh, this is kind of weird and sussy. But apparently he stated that he would be thinking about endorsing Wallace, because Wallace called him, and then people were why? But I have seen some people who were backing Garcia and Lightfoot and Wilson who were already talking about backing Johnson. So it's it's very likely that he's going to be, Johnson's probably going to get a lot of the endorsements for the remainder. Alright, so the last story is actually something that's very interesting because this shows a little bit of a failure for the Biden administration, but not one that will be affecting any of his chances for 2024. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, Marianne Williamson did announce officially the day I'm recording this. I'm not really going to talk about it because I already talked a little bit about it in the previous episode, because last week she accidentally announced that she was officially running. But here's what ended up happening. So Washington D.C. has been thinking about pushing forward a crime bill. So they wanted to amend the crime laws in their area. It was passed by the D.C. City Council unanimously, and it seeked to do a lot of things, but the biggest thing that they wanted to do was that they would eliminate the mandatory sentences and lower penalties for a number of violent offenses, including carjackings and robberies, and expand the requirement for jury trials in most misdemeanor cases. So they want to make sure that the justice system's a little more fair and not harsh and punitive. The incumbent DC mayor, Muriel Bowser, decided to veto it, but the veto was overridden, so it was set to become law. However, there was a problem. You see, in order for them to do this, they have to get the official approval of the United States House, since the District of Columbia is a federal district. And the United States House, it decided to, instead of just rubber stamping approval it, House Republicans were very much against this idea. So they pushed forth a bill that would try to stop this. And here's what ended up happening. 173 House Democrats voted no on the bill. A decent number of, members of the House who are Democrats voted yes. But they're of course, they're the neolib type candidates. What ended up happening was the 173, House members were doesn't matter anyways. We're just doing this because it's the right thing to do. Because we know that Biden is going to veto this because he said point blank that he would, respect DC's autonomy. And when this goes to the Senate, and if it passes the Senate, he'll just veto the bill anyways, and we'll be able to declare victory. But then, what ended up happening is, Joe Biden made the announcement that if the bill goes to his desk, he's going to sign it. And in fact, urged the members of the Senate to support the bill, and Democrats, who voted against it, were absolutely furious. One of them, anonymously stating, "The White House fucked this up royally, so a lot of us who are allies voted no in order to support what the White House wanted, and now we are being hung out to dry. Fucking amateur hour, heads should roll over at what the White House is doing." And nowhere was criticism more evident than Eleanor Holmes Norton, DC's delegate to the United States House, who was just so perplexed at this. Because, again, this is the thing. Biden said he was going to do one thing, he governed differently. I honestly can't get too mad because, again, I did not expect Biden to do much. So, like, Biden is basically governing how I said he would do, how he was going to govern. So there's not much else to say on that. So let's move on to the main topic of this video. Oh boy, this is going to be interesting. We're going to be talking about one of those fangled social democratic Nordic model countries that everybody talks about. You know, the ones that, like, people say are socialist, but then others say are clearly not socialist. What's my 2 cents? Depends. I made, like, a thread about it in a reply to, like, a Twitter account where it was like, okay, so what I said was that if the Social Democratic Party of that country has a history of socialism within it, and then it probably counts. And just for the sake of this one, like, this one, the one in this country, is affiliated with Socialist International, so take that with what you will. It also depends on your definition of, like, what a social democrat is and what a socialist is and whatever. The country in question is Finland. I know one thing's for sure, we gotta hurry up and finish this episode. I should preface it with this. I don't know if this one or the next foreign election video will be the most boring, because this one and the next one, it's really hard to find out, like, one thing that makes these foreign election videos interesting. And that is, like, particular events that happened during the campaign. But hopefully I can make up for it in some capacity with everything else. With that, let's just get into it. Finland is going to be holding a general election on April 2nd, 2023. But in order to understand how important these upcoming elections are, we're going to have to go a little bit backwards. Not like the Brazilian election, we only have to go back as far as 2015, because it was the first election to use a proportional representation model. The way their election works is that each party provides an open list with proportional representation in 13 multi-member constituencies, and the seats are allocated via the Daunt method, also known as the Jefferson method or the greatest divisors method. From what I gather, it's basically like statewide elections, but each state has proportional representation. So rather than just like a full-on proportional representation, each state has a proportional representation. So, like, for example, one party can do really, really well in one state, and they get a lot of seats in that state, but in a different state, they don't do well, so they don't get any seats. At least that's what I've gathered. And when they introduced this new method in 2015, it led to the 2 mainstream parties in that country getting 3rd and 4th place, which meant there was going to be a lot of changes for the country moving forward. The incoming center-right government, led by businessman Juha Sipilä, was not able to do a lot, and economic situations went bad for Finland. That, mixed with immigration and the fact the government could not reform the healthcare system, led to him resigning in 2019. New elections came, and like what usually happens in European countries is the fact that when a new election is called in a trying time, usually they shift far right, but somehow, I don't know why, this one managed to shift to the center-left. I'd assume probably because the Nordic model probably loves the center-left. The incoming social democratic government was led by Antti Rinne. However, a mere 5 months into his administration, he decided to transfer the work contracts of 700 of their postal workers, and they went on a massive strike, which culminated in Rinne's resignation, and he was immediately replaced by a new member of the party. Well, not new as in like new, but like new to this prime ministership. That person being Sanna Marin. Sanna Marin is the youngest prime minister Finland has ever had, and she's had a lot of expectations heading her way. And boy, did she have her work cut out for her, as she entered government immediately as the COVID pandemic began. Marin was actually one of the few leaders that was good on COVID and declared a state of emergency, which helped mitigate COVID in the area. Phew. Man, normally world leaders don't have to like deal with a worldwide crisis in their first attempt at being a leader. But thankfully, she got hers out of the way at the beginning, so I'm pretty sure nothing else will happen. Then Russia decided to invade Ukraine, which put her in a little bit of a tight spot, considering the fact that her nation is one of the few non-NATO nations in Europe. And not only that, Europe's main leader against Putin, I guess, like the person who was considered like their forefront leader, Angela Merkel, was gone. And this actually was kind of good for her, because that sort of put her in a position to become the new leader of Europe in the conflict. Granted, she wasn't like the only one. Emmanuel Macron was also seen as like a prominent like leader in Europe during the crisis. But Marin really stepped up to the plate, especially considering her country was not in NATO. She was one of the leading people to like urge the EU to stop using Russian oil and advocating for Finland to become part of NATO. Now, while most people would look at this and think, this is actually very interesting. Like, even though she's a relatively young person, it's really interesting to see her step up to the plate. However, her age and gender has also led to a lot of issues, because that has put her, like, since she is a young woman, she now has like 10 times more scrutiny on her than someone that is like twice her age and with different chromosomes. You know, she's a younger person, so she has a tendency of going out and partying, and shock of all shocks, the nation is using this as a reason to say she's not a good leader. Granted, the first time that this was a criticism was that it was actually somewhat fair, because she was partying during like she was partying after she had been exposed to the COVID virus earlier that day, which was like, okay, that's a bit like interesting. That's a bit like kind of rude, I guess. She should have handled herself better. Granted, from the way that she worded it, it was like she didn't know that they had COVID, but it's like she should have taken precautions to make sure of that, but whatever. The more recent one, however, was not justified, where she was just having fun with her friends, and she was accused of being a gay drug addict because she like was in a picture with her friends and two of her friends were kissing, and it was like I don't know, I guess girls do that. But again, like, this isn't a big deal. Like, this wouldn't be a big deal for anybody else, but since it's a young female, of course it's a big deal. And as you can probably guess, the main issues of the campaign are probably like the final rounds of the COVID pandemic, and of course the Ukraine situation and NATO. Now that that's out of the way, we can get into the candidates and parties. Now, this is going to be divided into two sections, but these two sections are not necessarily one-to-one. You see, the first section is all of the opposition parties that are represented in the parliament. Even the ones that do not have that much to talk about, because the first one I'm going to mention, I'm just mentioning it just because it's funny, but not really funny, but like, you know, I'll tell you it in a second. The party is called Power Belongs to the People. It is a small far-right political party born from the anti-vax movement that has now evolved to become just a more generic far-right party. They're pro-Russia, they're Nazis, and they support QAnon, and it's like, thankfully, they are not that prominent. They only have one member of parliament who is considered their leader. The person in question is Ano Turtianen, a member of parliament that was kicked out of a larger right-wing party after he mocked the death of George Floyd. The next one is also a one-person party. The party in question is called Movement Now. It's a small center-right political party, which is a vehicle for their founder, Hialis Harkimo, to be, like, just unique. But the rest of these guys, they actually do have many members. The next party is the Christian Democrats. As the name suggests, they are a party of Christian Democrats. Broadly, they're still center-right, mostly focusing on their social conservatism as opposed to any economics, but they're just like a prominent center-right political party. They're not like one of the mainstays. Their leader is former athlete and like European Parliament member Sari Essayah. The next party is the Finns Party. It's a more traditional right-wing populist party, the thing that we used to call Nazis before other groups became way more blatant in being Nazis. Their leader is a member of parliament by the name of Rika Perda. And the last opposition party, it's the National Coalition Party. They're the main center-right party, or at least, they're the main center-right party, but they used to be the main right-wing party, but the Finns party took them over. I might say, if the Finns are smaller than them, why'd you mention the National Coalition last? Well, we'll get to that when we get to that. All you need to know about them for now is their leader is former Deputy Prime Minister Petteri Orpo. Now, this next group are actually connected because they are the current governing coalition. I guess technically you could call them the left coalition, but that's not necessarily quite accurate. And we'll get to why in a second here. But the first one we're going to mention is the Swedish People's Party of Finland. Now, when you hear me say that, you immediately go, wait. The Swedish People's Party? Wait. What? Like, the name is confusing, but let's explain. It is a party that represents the interest of Swedish-speaking minorities, since Sweden is the neighbor of Finland. In a way, they're kind of like the Scottish National Party, but for Swedish people in Finland. Like, they're like center-left, I guess. Like, they mostly represent like a liberal, sort of like the liberal middle class, I guess. Their leader is NP Anna-Maja Henriksson. The next party is probably the one that most people might be familiar with. I mean, to a degree. The party in question is the Left Alliance. They are the mainstream left-wing voice in Finland. Now, I know what you may be saying. Isn't Finland already left-wing since they're governed by the Social Democrats? Like, basically, these are the people that make sure that the Social Democrats don't veer right. These are the people that keep the Social Democrats in the center-left. Don't like go full on into the capitalist mode. These are likes of like Mélenchon, like the prominent left-wing voices in the country to combat like a more center-left voice. Because in foreign nations, even the center-left and the left wing don't have to pretend to be allies. They can just be candidates against each other, and they'll be able to have their own voices and own parties. They are led by MP Lee Anderson. The next candidate is the Green League, an environmentalist party. These are the people that are basically like, I mean, you know how like the Green Party in America is like eco-socialist? Yeah, well, these guys are not like that. These guys are like the Green Parties of basically every other nation. They're like green liberal, like center to center left-ish. They're not really that like prominent outside of like the environmentalist issue. They are led by MP Maria Ohisalo. Now the next one is probably the most noticeably far off removed from the left alliance's like coalition ideology. The next party is the Center Party, though to a degree, maybe they're closely related, but this is where it gets confusing because the Center Party on paper, as the name suggests, is a centrist party. But when you get into the details, you start to realize something's not quite right. Like, it's sort of considered also an agrarian party, like a Nordic agrarian party, and it has like a lot of like focus in like certain areas. But the issue is, it apparently does not base its ideology on economics or actual policies, but more of like a weird, vague, almost hippie-like sentiment. Like, here is how the Center Party is described. The ideology of the party is unusual in the European context. Unlike many other large parties in Europe, its ideology is not primarily based on economic systems, rather the idea of humanity, education, the spirit of the land, peasant-like freedom, decentralization, the issue of poor people, environmentalism, and progressivism play a key role in Center Party's politicians' speeches and writings. From the very beginning of its presence, the party has supported the idea of decentralization. So in a way, are they actually in the left wing's like actual radar? Because they do kind of come off a little bit anarchistic. I mean, I'm pretty sure if I went into like their actual like policies and how their politicians voted, they would not be considered anarchistic. But it's just weird. Like, they're the strangest party of them all, and despite that, they're actually relatively popular. They're the fourth largest party in Sweden at the moment. Their leader is Deputy Prime Minister Annika Saarikko. And the last party is pretty obvious. They're the Social Democratic Party. They're the mainstream center-left force, and their leader is Shanna Marin. And this is the sad part where I have to tell you, like, again, I couldn't really find that much information in regards to events of the campaign. They're probably there, but sadly, I just couldn't find them. Now, of course, this is the part where it gets interesting. Polling. You see, originally, people were expecting, with the failure of the Rene government, that there would be a takeover of a different party, the first polls that were conducted very early on showed basically like that the Finns party was expected to win. Here are the results for the Finns party for certain polls. 18%, 18%, 19%, 18%, 19, 20, 19, 19, 20, 19, 20, 20, 19, 20, 20, 20, 23, 24, 24, 22, 24, 22, 23, 21, 22, 22, 21. But then things change with the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like when COVID starts hitting hard, the Social Democrats, of course, start doing well because the government actually did a decently good job in regards to the COVID pandemic. But as soon as certain things were like easing up a bit, that's when the Finns gained popularity again. However, then, during local elections, the National Coalition did well. Like they did well in those elections, so then that was seen as the party that was the only way to combat the Social Democrats. And they've been doing well ever since. Here are the results that have happened since then. 19, 19, 20, 19, 21, 20, 20, 21, 20, 21, 21, 21, 20, 21, 21, 22, 22, 26, 24, 24, 25, 24, 23, 23. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't have to keep listing numbers. Well, I will have to list numbers eventually because, like, that was how things were going. And then, beginning 2023, we started seeing something interesting. 22, 21, 21, 20. They started declining in polls. And, like, the Social Democrats, they haven't necessarily been making that many gains. Like, here are all the polls that were conducted in 2023. The first one, the National Coalition got 22.8%. The Social Democrats had 18.5%. Meanwhile, the Finns party, 19.1%. So, Social Democrats were in third. Then the next poll, National Coalition was 21%. The Social Democrats were 19.1%. And the Finns were 18.4%. Then the next poll, 21 for the National Coalition, 19 for the Social Democrats, and 20 for the Finns. Then for the most recent poll, 20.8% for the National Coalition, 19.9% for the Social Democrats, and 19 for the Finns. So they are going to be making like some slight gains, but I don't think that it's going to be that noticeable. Like, I mean, I hate to say it, but there seems to be a good chance that maybe the only thing that happens is the National Coalition and the Finns swap. And then maybe if they get what might end up happening is that if they get big enough, then maybe them and the Finns might officially join up in a governing coalition, but I don't know. Now, here's the thing. What I wanted to do was I was going to look at the polls and then do a calculation with the Daunt method and go, okay, maybe I can actually try to calculate how many seats that they're going to get. But then, one small problem arose. Apparently, Finland does not have an official threshold to get seats under this thing. Apparently, each state or constituency has their own threshold, and it would be a little too difficult for me to go through each of them because I don't think I could find them anywhere. Because again, they don't really have an official threshold. Each one basically decides you got close enough. If it was a nationwide one like they do in Israel, then there would be a amount that they have to meet. But since they're doing it state by state, then whatever. And of course, conclusions and support. Well, I gotta say this. It's been on the website for 10,000 years, but this is when I started looking into it. But the thing is, I think that the best solution would be to continue to support Shauna Marin, because I've looked into her record and what she's done, and she's done a pretty good job as a prime minister. Here's a little blurb that I have that explains my viewpoint. The youngest prime minister of Finland, who has faced a lot of critiques due to her age and sex. Despite this, she has led a decently left-wing government and has become the forefront leader in Europe, particularly in regards to COVID and Ukraine. But I don't support the coalition as it is, as I state further, But I also urge stronger voices to her left to make her coalition stronger through the Left Alliance and the Green League. Basically, I want a coalition of the SDP, the Greens, and the Left Alliance, and I want the rest of them. I want that coalition to be big enough that they don't need these other parties to muddy the waters. Is that what's going to happen? No. What's more likely going to happen is that Shanna Marin might end up losing by a small margin. But either way, Shanna Marin's a pretty decently left-wing candidate, and I think she should continue being prime minister. If I were there, I'd probably vote for her. Well, I mean, I'd probably vote for the Left Alliance. Probably. Maybe. It'd probably depend, I guess. With proportional representation, it would make me more likely to vote for the Left Alliance. So yeah, vote if you happen to be a Finnish person in my audience, vote for the Left Alliance. Or if you think that this is a tough area for the Social Democrats, maybe vote for them. I don't know. Either way, you're basically making sure that the Social Democrats have a higher chance of becoming the prime minister. I mean, unless somehow this is going to be a Left Alliance blowout, in which case I'd be even more happy. So anyways, that's basically all I have to say on that topic. Tune in to the next election video. It's going to come at one point in the future, and you'll figure out if this one's going to be the disappointing one or if that one is. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and click the bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.